What if the mirrors in your home weren't just harmless reflections, but gateways? When Sarah moves into her new house seeking a fresh start, she and her son stumble upon a terrifying secret, an ancient ritual left unfinished, mirrors that breathe, and creatures waiting patiently behind the glass. As reality begins to fracture, Sarah must confront not only a forgotten past but a horrifying truth. Some reflections aren't waiting to be seen. They're waiting to pull you in. Prepare yourself. The mouth never fully closes. The first thing I noticed wasn't the house. It was the window across the street. Someone was already watching us. The car crept down Maple Crescent like it knew this wasn't a place to rush through. The neighborhood looked like it had been frozen in some distant past. Rows of identical Victorian-style homes, each painted in muted shades of gray and white, trimmed with navy shutters and perfect little front lawns cut like carpet squares. Neat, orderly, lifeless. Oliver sat silently in the passenger seat, clutching his old stuffed rabbit close to his chest. His eyes, those big hazel eyes, watched the world slip by with an unsettling kind of focus, like he was memorizing every single house, every single window. "How do you like it, sweetheart?" I tried to sound light, cheerful, but my voice rang hollow, even to me. He didn't answer right away, too deep in his own head. Finally, he whispered, "The houses are really close together." I forced a soft laugh as if that was something funny. "That makes it cozy. You know what Grandma used to say? Better a close neighbor than a far-off relative." Oliver's small fingers tightened around the bunny's drooping ears. He didn't respond. I parked the car in front of number 204 Maple Crescent and killed the engine. We sat there for a moment. I inhaled deeply, the crisp New Mexico air burning slightly in my lungs. The house looked harmless enough, smaller than the pictures had made it seem. Clean white siding, newly painted shutters, a narrow porch just big enough for a swing and a few potted plants. This was supposed to be a new beginning, a place where the past couldn't find us, where I could put the divorce behind me, where Oliver could finally have some kind of stability, where we both could breathe again. "You ready to see inside?" I asked. Oliver shrugged and climbed out of the car, trailing behind me as we stepped onto the stone pathway leading up to the porch. He paused at the base of the stairs, staring up at the house like it might swallow him whole. "It's okay," he mumbled. I chose to take that as a win. The moving truck arrived moments later, and the workers quickly unloaded a mountain of cardboard boxes onto the porch before disappearing like ghosts. By late afternoon, we were buried in half-unpacked furniture and piles of Oliver's toys. We spent the next couple of hours setting up his room first. Priority number one, the shelves filled up with his favorite dinosaur figurines. His books lined up neatly along the little window ledge, catching the amber glow of the sinking sun. I tried to fill the space with cheerful chatter, with music playing softly in the background, with the illusion of normalcy. But Oliver kept glancing toward the window. "Everything okay?" I asked gently, following his gaze. He nodded, but his little finger pointed outside. "The old lady's still watching." I moved closer, peeking through the curtain, and there she was, across the street, standing beneath the front porch awning of the house directly facing ours. An elderly woman in a faded floral dress, her salt and pepper hair twisted into a loose bun. She didn't wave, she didn't smile, she simply stood there staring directly into our window. I raised my hand and offered a small, awkward wave. No response. Slowly, she turned and disappeared back inside. "She's probably just curious about the new neighbors," I reassured Oliver, though the words felt thin. Even to me, her expression hadn't looked curious. It looked expectant. "Let's focus on finishing your room, okay?" I said, tousling his hair. Later that evening, we took a short walk around the neighborhood. The sun dipped behind the rows of rooftops, casting long, crooked shadows across the pavement. The street was strangely silent. No kids playing, no neighbors chatting, only the occasional bark of a dog in the distance. The few people we passed nodded politely but kept their distance, their eyes darting away the moment ours met. At one house, a middle-aged man opened his door after I knocked to introduce myself. His smile looked mechanical, tight around the corners of his mouth. "Welcome to the neighborhood," he said, voice flat. "Let us know if you need anything." "Thank you," I replied, forcing my own smile. "We're hoping for a fresh start." He nodded once, then closed the door firmly. As we rounded the corner back toward our home, another figure appeared, the old woman from earlier, standing at the edge of her porch like some ancient statue. "Hello," she croaked in a paper-thin voice as we passed. "Good evening," I offered politely. She squinted toward our house with watery blue eyes. "You should close your curtains after dark, dear. It's safer that way." I blinked. "Why is that?" She shook her head, barely perceptible. "Just do it." That night, after tucking Oliver into bed, he surprised me with a question. "Why did she say that about the curtains, Mom?" "Maybe she just wants us to stay safe," I offered, brushing his hair back. "Or keep the house cool. Or maybe she's just old-fashioned, nothing to worry about." But she looked scared. My stomach twisted. Scared of what? Oliver clutched his stuffed bunny tighter. "Of the people in the windows." I froze. "The people in the windows? What do you mean?" He hesitated, shrinking into his blanket. "Nothing. Never mind." I wanted to push, but his eyelids were already heavy with sleep. I kissed his forehead and whispered goodnight. As I closed his door behind me, I caught one last glance at the drawn curtains, and an involuntary shiver worked its way up my spine. The next few days blurred together in a haze of cardboard, unpacking, and nervous glances out the windows. I tried to keep things light for Oliver's sake. Pizza nights on the living room floor, cartoons playing softly while we arranged furniture. But beneath every ordinary moment pulsed that gnawing sense of being observed. Each night before bed, I made sure every curtain was drawn tight. I didn't believe in superstitions, not really. But there was something about the old woman's warning that clung to me, like the chill you feel right before a storm hits. Oliver had become oddly quiet. He spent hours sitting by his window during the day, not reading or playing, just watching. Every now and then, I'd catch his lips moving like he was whispering to someone I couldn't see. At breakfast one morning, I tried to break through his shell. "How are you settling in, kiddo? Starting to feel like home yet?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stirred his cereal, the spoon clinking softly against the bowl. Then finally, without looking up, he said, "Do you see them too?" My throat tightened. "See who, sweetie?" "The people," he whispered, "in the windows." I tried to keep my voice calm. "Oliver, there's no one there. You're just adjusting. It's a new place. It takes time." "They don't blink," he said softly, almost like confessing a sin. "They watch, but they don't blink." That night, I installed new locks on the windows and doors. The hardware store clerk had given me a funny look when I bought enough deadbolts for every possible entry point in the house. But I didn't care. Better safe than sorry. It was around 3:30 a.m. when I first heard it. A soft knock, barely audible. 3 gentle taps on the window pane closest to my bed. I froze under the covers, pulse pounding in my ears. The house was dark, except for the faint orange glow of the street light outside filtering through the curtains. I held my breath, waiting for it to come again. Nothing. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe it was the house settling, or a branch in the wind. But as I started to relax, the knocking came again. 3 deliberate taps. This time, from the window across the room. I sat up slowly, blood roaring in my head, heart hammering against my ribs. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice dry. No response. Swallowing the knot in my throat, I slid out of bed and approached the window. My fingers hovered near the edge of the curtain. Every instinct screamed not to look. I pulled it back in one swift motion. The street was empty, no one on the sidewalk, no shadows lurking near the porch, just the silent rows of houses, all their windows shut, curtains drawn, like they were hiding too. The rest of the night passed in a fog of half-sleep, jolting awake at every creak, every distant sound. When morning came, Oliver was already sitting at the kitchen table, fully dressed, staring into nothing. "You heard it too, didn't you?" he asked before I even said good morning. Heard what? The knocking. I didn't answer. My mouth had gone dry. All of his drawings became darker after that night. Gone were the colorful dinosaurs and superheroes. Now page after page showed tall, thin figures standing outside windows, their limbs too long, their heads slightly tilted. The eyes were always empty, black holes that stared out like voids. I tried to talk to him about it, but he'd just shake his head and clutch his bunny tighter. One afternoon, while sorting through old paperwork in the study, I came across a manila envelope I didn't recognize. No return address, no markings, just my name scrawled across the front. Inside were faded newspaper clippings from the Black Pine Gazette. Headlines screamed at me. Family disappears without trace, 1997. Fourth family vanishes in 3 years. Police, no evidence of foul play. A chill settled deep in my bones. The names of the missing families were listed, and buried among them was one name that made my stomach lurch. Whitmore, my own. My father, my mother, me. The article said I was the sole survivor of the Whitmore disappearance. Age 6, found wandering Maple Crescent, uninjured but unable to speak. The report noted that I had no memory of the event, but I didn't remember any of this. I stared at the words until they blurred. My breathing grew shallow, panic rising like bile. A knock at the door startled me so violently I nearly fell out of my chair. I opened the front door cautiously. It was the old woman from across the street, Mrs. Landry. "You shouldn't have come back here, dear," she said softly, eyes full of pity. "I don't understand." "You were never supposed to leave," she whispered. "Not you." "What does that mean?" My voice cracked. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "They're waiting, child. They've always been waiting." I shut the door and locked it behind her, heart pounding like a drumbeat inside my chest. That night, the knocking came again, louder this time. More insistent, it moved around the house, window to window, like something circling its prey. Oliver crawled into bed beside me, his small body trembling. "They're not outside anymore," he whispered. "What?" "They don't need to be." The knocking stopped, and then, from the far corner of the room, came a faint, wet breath, as if someone was exhaling against the glass of the mirror. The second time the knocking came, I was already awake. I hadn't really slept since that night. It was 3:33 a.m., the exact time on the clock glowing beside my bed, as if whatever was outside had memorized some cruel schedule. 3 sharp knocks on the living room window, then silence. I sat up, heart pounding, and reached for the small flashlight I kept on the nightstand. The house was still as death, every curtain drawn tight, every lock checked and double-checked before bed, but no amount of locks could shut out the sensation that something was close, closer than before. From the hallway I heard the faint creak of Oliver's door opening. His tiny figure appeared in the doorway, clutching the stuffed bunny like a talisman. "They're back," he whispered. I forced my voice steady. "You stay here, baby." He shook his head and walked toward me, eyes wide, haunted. "They move now." I swallowed hard. "What do you mean?" "They're not just outside." For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then the knocking resumed, this time on the kitchen window, then the dining room. Each knock precise, like fingers deliberately tracing the perimeter of the house. I grabbed my phone and quickly checked the indoor camera feeds I'd installed 2 days ago. Cheap Amazon hallway cams I thought might bring me some comfort. One by one, the cameras blinked to life. Bedrooms clear, hallway empty, basement locked, front and back doors secure. But then, the living room feed glitched. Static lines danced across the screen, flickering like an old VHS tape. And for a brief second, less than a heartbeat, I saw something. A shape. Not outside, inside. Tall, thin, just standing behind the couch. Its head slightly cocked as if listening. No face, only a smudged blur where features should have been, then gone. I stared at the screen, pulse hammering in my ears. The knocking stopped. Oliver crawled up beside me on the bed, curling under the covers. "Don't open the curtains," he whispered. "They don't like that." That morning, as sunlight finally seeped through the cracks, I decided to get answers. There had to be something, some reason why this was happening. Mrs. Landry wasn't outside that day. Her porch sat empty, rocking chair swaying gently in the wind. I knocked, called her name, but no response. Windows shuttered tight. I moved on to the neighbors 2 houses down. Ethan and Marla, a young couple who'd moved in around the same time we had. They had always kept to themselves, but desperation made me brave. Ethan opened the door cautiously, peering through the small crack before unlocking the chain. "Morning," I offered, forcing a polite smile that felt brittle. I was wondering if you've noticed anything strange at night." His expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. "What kind of strange?" he asked. "The knocking? The shapes outside or inside?" He glanced behind him toward Marla, who hovered further back in the living room, arms crossed tightly over her chest. "We keep our curtains closed," Ethan said flatly. "Mrs. Landry warned me about that too," I said, my voice quickening. "But why? What are we supposed to be keeping out?" For a second, it looked like he might slam the door in my face. Instead, he leaned in, lowering his voice so only I could hear. "You're not keeping anything out," he said. "The curtains aren't for you. They're for them, so they don't have to see you." I blinked, trying to process the absurdity of it. "What does that mean?" "They get confused when they see themselves. That's why it slows them down." His eyes darted nervously. "But not forever." My stomach twisted. "Ethan? What are they?" His jaw clenched. "I don't know. No one does. But once they see you, really see you, they follow." Before I could say another word, he closed the door quietly but firmly. I staggered back toward my house, mind spinning. Inside, Oliver was sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, drawing again. More of the same haunting figures, elongated limbs wrapped around window frames, heads cocked unnaturally, eyes empty. "They're closer today," he said softly without looking up. I crouched down next to him. "How do you know that, baby?" He paused as if the answer was obvious. "Because I feel them. They're watching even when the curtains are closed now." I gently pulled the paper from his hands, trying to hold back the growing panic. Each drawing seemed to get darker, more detailed. In one, multiple figures stood shoulder to shoulder, crowding against the glass. In another, hands pressed flat against the surface, leaving greasy smudges. Later that afternoon, I visited the county library downtown, desperate for any records about this street, this house. The librarian on duty, an older woman named Mrs. Kavanaugh, looked at me sympathetically as I explained what I was searching for. "Maple Crescent?" she repeated. "That area's had its share of incidents." "What kind of incidents?" I asked. She pursed her lips. "Families moving out suddenly, people disappearing, but no one ever filed proper reports. You know how small towns are. People talk but never write anything down." She led me to a back room filled with dusty archived newspapers and county records. It smelled like mold and forgotten things. As I scanned the yellowed pages, pieces of a horrifying puzzle began falling into place. Missing persons reports from the 90s. An unusually high number of mental health commitments at Black Pine Mental Hospital. Strange property transfers. Whispered rumors about reflections and unseen residents. But it was one article that made my blood run cold. A front-page piece from June 12, 1997. My parents' names. The Whitmore family, reported missing. No bodies ever found. Only their 6-year-old daughter was recovered. Me. The photograph showed a little girl with tangled brown hair, standing barefoot under a street lamp. Eyes vacant. I couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. I had no memory of any of it. But the evidence was right there in my hands. The past I thought I'd escaped hadn't been erased. It had been waiting. The house was different when I returned. It wasn't anything obvious. The walls were still intact. the furniture where I'd left it, the air still carrying that faint scent of new paint and old wood. But something had shifted, like the house itself was holding its breath. Oliver was sitting on the staircase when I walked in, his legs dangling, his bunny limp in his lap. He looked up at me, his face pale and tight, like he hadn't blinked in hours. "They were inside while you were gone," he whispered. I froze. My keys nearly slipped from my fingers. "What do you mean? Inside where?" "In the hallway," he said, voice flat. "They don't always stay in the windows anymore." My vision blurred for a moment as dizziness swept over me. I forced myself to move, to check every door, every lock, every room, even the basement, but everything was undisturbed, nothing out of place, nothing I could see, but I felt them, the pressure, the weight in the air. That night, I placed tape over every mirror in the house, bathroom, hallway, closets, even the reflective surface of the microwave. Oliver watched me work, eyes wide, silently following me from room to room like a shadow. The knocking returned at precisely 3:33 a.m., as if drawn by some unseen rhythm. 3 knocks. Silence. 3 knocks. Silence. Always in perfect intervals. But this time, I didn't get up. I lay in bed, clutching Oliver tightly against me, listening as the knocks circled the house like something pacing outside a cage, and then it stopped. The silence was worse than the knocking. The next morning, Ethan showed up, uninvited. I found him standing on my porch, his face pale, his eyes sunken. He wasn't alone. Marla stood a few feet behind him, trembling, her hands wringing the hem of her sweater. "They're escalating," Ethan said without any greeting. "You feel it too, don't you?" I nodded, too exhausted to pretend anymore. Ethan stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Once they've marked you, the rules change." "What rules?" I demanded, my frustration boiling over. "No one will tell me what the hell is happening." Marla spoke for the first time, her voice barely audible. "They don't like being seen. They want to exist where you don't acknowledge them. That's why the curtains, the covered mirrors, it's not to keep them out. It's to keep them content." "And if I don't?" I asked. "They start entering," Ethan said simply. "Through reflections, through weak points. You've seen them, haven't you? In the cameras, the glass." I swallowed hard, recalling the distorted figure behind my couch. "Why me?" My voice cracked. "Why my family? Why my son?" Marla's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Because you were supposed to be theirs long ago," Ethan cut her off sharply. "We said enough." Before I could stop them, they both turned and hurried back to their house, their door slamming shut like a prison gate locking behind them. I stood there for a long moment, staring across the quiet street. The sun hung low, casting long, eerie shadows. Behind the drawn curtains of every other house, I felt eyes watching. Windows weren't just windows here, they were thresholds. Later that evening, as dusk bled into night, the air inside the house grew heavy. The old floorboards groaned with every step, and the silence stretched into something unbearable. Oliver clung to my side as I tucked him into bed. "I don't want to sleep here tonight," he whispered. "You'll be safe," I lied, "but they're already inside." His words made my stomach clench. "We locked all the doors, baby." He shook his head. "They don't need doors." I turned on his nightlight and kissed his forehead, whispering empty reassurances that neither of us believed. Hours passed. I couldn't sleep. Instead, I sat in the living room, staring at the taped-over mirror above the fireplace, the strips of black duct tape forming a crude X across its surface. My reflection was fragmented, distorted, like even my image didn't want to look back at me anymore. A faint static hum filled the room. I realized it was coming from the security cameras. I grabbed my phone and pulled up the live feed again. Living room? Clear. Hallway? Clear. Front porch? Static. The screen flickered, then briefly stabilized, and there, for a split second, I saw it again. The same figure, only this time it was standing directly in front of the door, closer than ever, head tilted, arms hanging like dead weight, featureless, watching. I nearly dropped the phone as a chill ripped through my chest. The camera feed cut to black. A sharp knock sounded from the hallway mirror. I jumped, heart slamming into my ribs. The sound was too deliberate to be anything else. 3 heavy, deliberate taps against the taped glass. Oliver screamed from upstairs. I bolted up the staircase, taking 2 steps at a time, bursting into his room. He was sitting up in bed, pointing toward the closet mirror. His voice shook with terror. "They're in there!" I ripped open the closet, yanking the doors wide. Empty. Nothing but clothes and shadows. But on the inside of the mirror, beneath the tape, I saw it. A handprint. Smudged. Long, skeletal fingers pressed against the inside surface, like it had tried to push through. I backed away slowly, grabbing Oliver into my arms. "They're getting stronger," he whispered into my shoulder. I held him tighter as I carried him to my room, locking the door behind us. My breathing was shallow, the fear thick like syrup in my throat. Through the thin bedroom walls, I heard it again. Knock, knock, knock. But not from the windows this time, from the mirrors. The sound of knocking had become part of the house now, night after night, always at 3:33 a.m., like some ancient metronome counting down to something neither Oliver nor I understood. But this time was different. When the first knock came, it was no longer distant, like from a far window. It was inside. Inside the house. Knock. It came from the hallway mirror. Not loud, soft, almost polite, but the politeness made it worse somehow, as if the thing on the other side had grown confident enough to announce itself without fear. Oliver whimpered beside me. He'd stopped crying days ago. Now it was only trembling. A silent, constant vibration through his small frame. "They're closer now," he whispered against my shoulder. "I think they know my name." The words twisted inside me like a blade. I clutched him tighter, rocking gently as if my arms could form any meaningful barrier. The knock came again, then another, from the mirror in the bathroom down the hall, and another, from the one covered behind black tape in the guest bedroom. The house had become an instrument, and something was playing it. By morning, the knocks stopped, but something worse had taken their place. The reflections. The mirrors weren't just reflecting us anymore. They were wrong. When I looked into the small bathroom mirror as I brushed my teeth, I saw myself, but delayed, just slightly, a half-second too long. Like my reflection was struggling to catch up, or hesitating to mimic me. Sometimes the reflection would smile when I wasn't. I began to avoid mirrors entirely. Any surface that could hold an image became suspect. The kitchen window when the lights were on inside, the polished door handles, the black glass screen of my phone. Every reflective surface felt like an open eye. The county library became my only sanctuary during the day. Mrs. Kavanaugh had seen me so often now that she no longer asked why I kept returning, why my hands shook as I flipped through dusty files and old police reports. Maple Crescent, I told her again that morning. Specifically, my house. 204. Her thin lips pressed into a grim line. "That street has always had anomalies," she finally said, as if the word itself tasted sour. "Families don't stay long. Many disappear." "Disappear how?" I asked. She slid a cardboard box across the desk, her fingers hesitant. "I've kept some of the older records they didn't want to keep in public files. They don't like people asking about certain things." Inside were faded photographs, property transfer records, and newspaper clippings, many of them incomplete, some blacked out by heavy marker. One article caught my eye, an editorial piece from 1997. "Community reeling after fourth family vanishes. County officials dismiss mirror rumors as small-town superstition." My stomach turned. It was dated only weeks after my family had gone missing. There was even a grainy black and white photo of the house I now lived in. The same front porch, the same navy shutters, but the windows. Dozens of faces pressed against them in the photograph. Shadowy, barely distinguishable, but unmistakably human shapes. Mrs. Kavanaugh watched me closely as I stared at the image. "That picture was taken by a reporter who didn't stay in town long after," she whispered. "He said the film developed images he never captured, faces that shouldn't be there." I felt the weight of her words settle on my chest like wet cement. "They are real, aren't they?" My voice cracked. Her expression softened into something close to pity. "I don't know what they are, dear, but I know they've always been here, and I know your family was part of it." I blinked, confused. "My family?" She nodded gravely. "Your parents, your grandparents before them, they weren't just victims. They were part of a group. Some called it a church, others whispered darker words. But they believed the mirrors were a gateway, that they could control what was on the other side." "And what happened?" I whispered. Her voice dropped to a hush. "They failed." I could barely stand. My legs felt hollow, my breath shallow and sharp. "They tried to seal the breach, and when it went wrong, families vanished. Those who remained swore silence." I swallowed, my throat raw. "And me?" "You were found wandering alone on Maple Crescent the night your family disappeared." She reached into the box and pulled out a photograph. "You were 6. There I was, barefoot under a flickering streetlight, staring blankly at the camera. I didn't recognize myself. I couldn't remember." "They made you forget," Mrs. Kavanaugh whispered. "Or something else did." I shoved the box away, my stomach turning violently. As I drove home, the late afternoon sky hung low with bruised clouds, casting the neighborhood in a dull, oppressive gray. The rows of identical houses felt even closer now, as if shrinking toward me, collapsing in like a throat closing around breath. Oliver was waiting for me on the porch steps when I pulled into the driveway, his face pale, his small frame stiff. "They tried talking to me today," he said softly. I froze. "What did they say?" He shook his head. "I didn't answer, but they're getting louder." Inside the house, I saw the latest of his drawings scattered across the living room floor. This time, the figures weren't standing at windows anymore. They were inside. Long fingers reaching for a small child drawn at the center. His own representation of himself. All around him were the broken fragments of glass, like a shattered mirror. I gathered him into my arms, holding him as tight as I could. My chest ached with a pressure I could no longer contain. I whispered, more to myself than him, "I'll find a way to stop this, I promise." But I didn't believe it. Not yet. That night, the knocks didn't wait until 3:33. They started as soon as the sun went down, and this time they came from every room at once. The knocks were no longer subtle. They slammed against every window, every wall, every taped mirror in the house. A frantic rhythm, uncoordinated, desperate, angry. The house itself seemed to tremble with every hit, like the wood and plaster strained to hold back whatever clawed from the other side. Oliver clung to me, his face buried into my side, his small body trembling as each knock reverberated through the air. "They're everywhere now," he whispered, voice shaking. "Mom, they're angry." I wanted to scream, to cry, but all I could do was hold him tighter, my own breath ragged, eyes darting from window to window. The curtains bulged inward, not from wind, but from the repeated tapping of long skeletal fingers just behind the fabric. And then, as quickly as it started, it stopped. The house fell into an unnatural silence, like it had been drained of air. Even the usual creaks of the old floorboards vanished. It was as if time itself had frozen. I glanced at the clock. 3:33 a.m. again. Always 3:33. The silence lasted only seconds before something new started. A faint hum. A vibration. The mirrors began to pulse, not violently, not cracking yet, but they breathed. The glass warped ever so slightly, as though the reflections inside were pressing closer, swelling and shrinking in rhythm with an invisible breath. I grabbed Oliver and pulled him upstairs into my bedroom, locking the door behind us. The lock felt pathetic, useless against what we were up against. I pressed my ear to the wall, listening. The humming grew louder, accompanied by faint whispers that bled through the drywall like vapor. "They're inside the house," Oliver said flatly, "but they haven't crossed over yet." "What do you mean?" My voice cracked with terror. He looked up at me with eyes that no child should ever have, calm in the face of something unspeakable. "They live inside the reflections. As long as the mirrors hold, they can't fully come through." His words hit me like a punch. Somehow, impossibly, my 7-year-old understood more than I did, and somehow I knew he was right. I grabbed my phone with shaking hands, pulling up the security feed. But the cameras were useless now. Every screen was pure static, occasionally flickering to half-formed images of dark, crooked shapes standing far too close to the lenses. Faces that weren't faces, limbs too long and bent at impossible angles. Suddenly, one of the feeds cleared for just a fraction of a second. The hallway. There was something standing by the mirror. No, not something. Someone. A tall, thin figure. Not blurry this time. Fully formed. Its skin a pale, almost translucent gray. Its head tilted sharply, as if studying its own twisted reflection in the mirror it stood before. The limbs too long, as if the joints bent wrong inside the skin. There were no eyes, only smooth hollows where eyes should be. It wasn't behind the mirror anymore, it was in front of it, and it was inside my house. I slammed the phone down, adrenaline pumping through my veins like acid. My instincts screamed to grab Oliver and run, but run where? The street? The town? We were already trapped long before we even moved here. A loud crack shot through the silence, sharp, violent. The mirror in the hallway had cracked. The thin spiderweb fracture glistened under the pale moonlight leaking through the upper windows. The glass pulsed once more, then stilled. "Stay here," I told Oliver, my voice trembling. He shook his head violently. "No, Mom, don't go near them." But I was already halfway down the stairs, flashlight in hand, my own fear swallowed by something deeper. A desperate need to understand what was happening before it became irreversible. When I reached the hallway, I could feel it. Something heavy in the air, like standing in the center of a vacuum. The mirror shuddered softly, like a membrane struggling to hold something back. The crack spread another inch with an audible snap, like the glass itself was struggling to keep its barrier intact. I took a trembling step forward, heart pounding so violently I thought my ribs might crack. The reflection no longer matched my movements. I raised my hand. The reflection did not. Instead, it stood still, its arms hanging limp, head tilted to one side, as though observing me like a specimen under glass. Its mouth twitched, a thin, cruel imitation of a smile that belonged to no human face. A cold gust of wind swept down the hall behind me, though no window or door was open. The temperature dropped sharply, my breath misting in front of me. The reflection stepped closer to the inside of the mirror, its movements jerky, unnatural. And then it spoke. Not aloud, but inside my head, as if the words were injected directly into my skull. "You were meant to stay." The voice was hollow, layered, not one voice but many speaking in unison. "You were always part of this house." My knees buckled, and I gripped the doorknob to steady myself. "Why me?" I gasped. The reflection's head jerked at an impossible angle. "Because you were the one who escaped." I stumbled back, my vision spinning. Suddenly, Oliver screamed from upstairs. The glass cracked again, violently this time, a web of fractures exploding across the mirror's surface, like lightning trapped in frozen time. I bolted upstairs, my legs barely functioning beneath me. Oliver stood frozen at the top of the stairs, pointing toward the guest room door, his face a mask of terror. "They're in the room, Mommy," he whimpered. "They came through." The door creaked open inch by inch without anyone touching it. Inside, the black tape I had placed across the mirror had been peeled off, laying on the floor in neat strips. The glass was no longer cracked. It was gone. Only a perfect black void remained, like an open mouth waiting to swallow everything. And from that blackness, long, thin fingers curled slowly outward, resting on the frame. The void inside the mirror didn't move that night. The fingers remained resting against the frame. as if the thing inside was testing the boundary, waiting for permission to fully enter. I didn't sleep. I sat at the edge of my bed, holding Oliver close as the house fell into an unnatural stillness. The air was heavy, electric. Every so often I thought I heard faint whispers, as though dozens of voices were speaking in unison through the walls, but whenever I strained to listen, they dissolved into silence. By morning, the fingers had receded. The mirror was whole again, as if nothing had ever happened, but it had. I could feel the rules changing. The boundaries were growing thinner. I knew then that I couldn't stay inside this house, waiting for whatever was behind the glass to finally break through. If there was any hope of protecting Oliver, it had to begin with answers. Real ones. Answers I should have sought long ago. I left Oliver with Mrs. Kavanaugh, who had become my unlikely ally. She didn't ask questions this time, only nodded in grim understanding as she took Oliver's hand. "Be careful," she said. "You won't like what you find." I drove toward the far edge of Black Pine Hollow, where the old county archives stood half forgotten behind rusting gates and overgrown hedges. The building once served as the original courthouse before being converted into a records depot decades ago. The town didn't advertise its existence anymore. Some things, it seemed, the town preferred to forget. Inside, dust coated everything like skin on a corpse. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, buzzing faintly. Rows of tall filing cabinets lined the narrow corridors, their drawers swollen from age. An elderly clerk greeted me without surprise. "Family research?" he asked dryly, as though this was routine. "Something like that," I said, forcing a tight smile. "The Whitmore family, records from 1997. The man's expression twitched for the briefest moment before returning to its previous blankness. "Restricted files," he said. "I'm not leaving without them," I whispered, my voice sharper than intended. Desperation burned through me. For a moment I thought he might refuse, but then, with a sigh of resignation, he unlocked a battered metal cabinet near the back of the room and slid open one of its heavy drawers. He handed me a slim manila folder, its edges yellowed, corners bent from years of disuse. Inside were fragmented reports, police statements, newspaper articles, psychiatric evaluations, and something far more chilling: church records. The name of the church was scrawled across the top of several forms: St. Augustine Evangelical Fellowship. I flipped through the pages, each one tightening the knot in my chest. The Whitmores weren't just residents of Maple Crescent. They were founding members of a congregation obsessed with purification rituals, mirror symbolism, and something repeatedly referred to as the reflection doctrine. The doctrine described an ancient belief, distorted from fragments of old-world superstition, that mirrors were portals, thin membranes separating our world from another reflection of existence. Not heaven, not hell, something else. And the congregation had attempted to control it. The rituals began innocently enough: prayers, fastings, elaborate mirror cleansings intended to seal the gateways. But over time, the ceremonies grew darker. Blood offerings, group trances, attempts to anchor entities from the other side. One name appeared repeatedly in the files: Reverend Elijah Grayson. I recognized the surname immediately. Father Grayson, the man who, according to Mrs. Kavanaugh, had once led the congregation before being excommunicated after the disappearances. An address was listed at the bottom of one of the files: an isolated property several miles outside Black Pine Hollow. The ink was faded but still legible. I knew where I had to go. The drive took nearly an hour, winding deeper into the rural outskirts, where the paved road gave way to dirt and the trees grew too close to the narrow path. The sky had turned a dull pewter gray, thick with pregnant storm clouds. Eventually, the woods parted, revealing a decrepit cottage barely standing beneath the weight of age and neglect. Ivy climbed the sagging roof, and shattered window panes stared out like hollowed eyes. I stepped out of the car, my heart beat loud in my ears. As I approached the door, it creaked open slightly, as if it had been waiting. Inside, the air smelled of mildew, burnt wax, and something else, an old metallic tang that made my stomach twist. The interior was sparse: a few toppled chairs, a broken cabinet against the far wall, Dozens of shattered mirror fragments had been nailed haphazardly into the wood, forming an uneven collage of broken reflections. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice was brittle, yet unmistakably human. I turned sharply. Father Grayson stood in the far corner, half shrouded in shadows. His face was gaunt, hollowed by years of isolation, but his eyes burned with a sharp, unnatural clarity. You're Reverend Grayson," I said, my voice barely holding. He nodded once. "And you are the child they lost." I swallowed hard, my breath shaky. "What did they do to me?" He chuckled bitterly. "The same thing they tried to do to many before you. They wanted to bargain with the other side, to trap it, control it, use it. But you slipped through. The ritual failed when my stomach lurched. Why do they want me now?" Grayson's face twisted into something between pity and fear. "Because unfinished offerings leave cracks. The breach was never sealed. You were supposed to be their anchor. Without you, they've been leaking through ever since." The breath caught in my throat. "They want me back." He stepped forward, lowering his voice to a whisper. "And they won't stop, not until they get what was promised." A crack of thunder roared overhead as the storm finally broke, and behind me one of the broken mirror fragments trembled. The storm outside grew violent, rattling the windows of the decaying cottage as wind howled through the broken shingles. Father Grayson moved slowly toward the wall of broken mirror shards, his thin fingers tracing along one jagged edge. "They weren't supposed to open it fully," he muttered, as though speaking more to himself than to me. "Not yet. Not without full sacrifice." I swallowed hard, trying to steady my voice. "You said I was the offering." He nodded once, his gaze distant. "The final piece. The anchor. Your bloodline made you special to them." I struggled to comprehend the weight of his words. My parents, the town, this church. All of it woven into a horrifying tapestry I hadn't known I was part of. The images in Oliver's drawings suddenly took on new meaning. They weren't just visions, they were memories, echoes of something unfinished. "The ritual failed," I said, "and now they're trying again." "They never stopped," Grayson replied. His voice trembled for the first time, showing the depth of his own terror. "The mirrors were only meant to serve as windows, but once they cracked, once the first fracture formed, they became doors." I stared at the fractured wall, noticing for the first time how the mirror shards pulsed slightly, almost imperceptibly, like breathing lungs. "Their world mirrors ours," Grayson continued. "Not heaven, not hell, something older, hungrier. They observe through reflection, mimicking, waiting for weakness, and once they mark you, once they know your shape, they can cross." I whispered the question I dreaded. "Have they crossed?" His eyes met mine, hollow and empty. "Some." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. I could feel the weight behind his simple answer, like a presence standing right behind me. "But why now?" I asked, my voice cracking. "Why after all these years?" He inhaled sharply, voice dropping lower. "Because you came back. You unknowingly reopened the wound, and now they're accelerating." As if summoned by his words, one of the mirror shards vibrated sharply behind him, emitting a faint, sickly hum that made my stomach twist. Grayson flinched but did not turn toward it. "They're growing impatient." Lightning cracked outside, illuminating the room in a violent flash. For a moment, I thought I saw something shift inside the largest shard. Not a reflection of me or Grayson, but something behind the glass, watching. Grayson's voice quivered. "Once they fully enter this side, there's no undoing it. The town, your son, you, everything will become part of their echo." I stepped back instinctively, heart pounding in my chest. "There has to be a way to stop this," I said, though my voice barely carried conviction. His eyes narrowed. "There's only one way. The breach must be sealed. Permanently." I felt my stomach knot. I knew what he was about to say. "The unfinished offering," I whispered. Grayson nodded grimly. "You." For a long moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. "You're telling me I have to sacrifice myself?" My voice shook with horror. "Not death," he said softly, "but your mind, your memory, your presence in this reality. They want to pull you into their mirror, into their world where you will remain. Only then can the breach close." He paused. "You won't die, but you won't be you anymore." The very thought of it made my skin crawl. To exist as some hollowed shell, trapped on the other side, while my body became just another reflection for them to mimic? It was a fate worse than death. "There has to be another way," I whispered. "Something else." Grayson's voice broke slightly, like a man finally nearing his own edge. "If there was, don't you think I would have taken it?" Another shard in the mirror wall cracked, this time with an audible snap that echoed through the house. The air became thick, pressing against my lungs. The storm outside crescendoed in perfect sync with whatever pulsed behind the glass. I could hear the faint scratching of long fingers tracing along unseen surfaces, dragging themselves closer. "They're here," Grayson whispered, his voice barely audible. The door behind me slammed shut on its own. The entire cottage vibrated. Shadows danced wildly across the walls as another pulse rippled through the mirrors. Inside the largest shard, the form now shifted fully forward. Tall, gaunt, its arms grotesquely elongated, fingertips brushing the interior of the glass, as though preparing to breach. I stumbled backward, breath quickening. I need to get back to my son. Grayson's eyes widened. "No! If you return now, you'll only lead them straight to him." "I have no choice," I snapped, panic overtaking me. "I'm not letting them take him." Before he could respond, the mirror behind him let out a sharp, splitting sound, a jagged fracture shooting across its surface like lightning trapped in glass. The thing inside pressed its hand fully against the glass now. The barrier was paper thin. In that moment, Grayson turned to face it. His shoulders slumped, voice resigned. "I've bought you what time I can," he whispered, "but you must hurry." As the glass gave a final groan, he glanced back at me one last time. "Steal them, or lose everything." The mirror burst. Shards of glass exploded outward like shrapnel. I shielded my face as a high-pitched shriek filled the room, not from Grayson, but from the thing stepping through the broken portal behind him. A silhouette that bent unnaturally as it emerged, its skin pale and waxy, its eyeless face twisting as though smiling beneath flesh that didn't belong. I bolted for the door, throwing it open as the wind and rain whipped into my face. Behind me, I heard Grayson scream. A sound not of pain, but something worse. A sound of being unraveled. I sprinted toward my car, heart hammering so loud it drowned out the storm. The headlights flickered as I slammed the door shut and jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life just as something pale moved in my peripheral vision, a flash of long limbs bending at wrong angles. I floored the gas and sped down the dirt path, the cottage shrinking in my rearview mirror as lightning illuminated the horror left behind. I didn't look back. I couldn't. All I could think of was Oliver, and that whatever followed me now, it was closer than ever. The tires skidded violently as I tore down Maple Crescent, the rain hammering the windshield in sheets. My knuckles turned white around the steering wheel as adrenaline blurred the road ahead into streaks of gray and black. I could feel them, not see, not hear, but feel. Like invisible hands pressing against the thin film of reality, crawling closer with every mile I gained. The pressure inside my head throbbed as though something was trying to burrow into my thoughts, twisting its way into my mind. I swerved onto my driveway, headlights slicing through the mist. Oliver was standing at the front window, his small silhouette framed by the flickering light inside. He was waiting. I burst from the car, sprinting through the downpour and throwing open the front door. "Mom!" Oliver ran into my arms, burying his face against my soaked jacket. "Are you okay? Did anything happen?" I asked, breathless. "They tried talking again," he whispered. "But I didn't answer like you told me." I exhaled, my breath shuddering as I pulled him tighter. For now, he was safe. But the air around us still pulsed, like the house itself was breathing. Behind Oliver, I saw them, not fully formed yet, still in the glass. Dozens of them. Every mirror, every darkened window pane, every smooth surface. Hands, faces, twisted mouth stretched in silent mockery. Some grinned, their eyeless sockets wide and empty. Others simply pressed their long fingers against the other side of the glass, waiting. The barrier was crumbling. I guided Oliver into the living room, away from the mirrors. The taped glass in the hallway now bulged slightly, as though the surface itself had turned to soft skin. The whispers returned. Not outside. Inside. Dozens of voices, overlapping and layered like a discordant choir. She was always ours. She opened the door. We are home. I gritted my teeth, trying to drown them out, but the words drilled directly into my skull. Oliver whimpered beside me, his eyes wide with terror. "What do we do, Mommy?" His voice cracked. I didn't know, but I couldn't let him see that. "We hold on," I whispered. "We don't let them in." As I spoke, the hallway lights flickered violently before shutting off entirely. The house fell into an oppressive darkness, broken only by the brief flashes of lightning outside. The reflections in the windows no longer matched us. I could see my own shape, but it moved differently, lagging slightly behind. Its head cocked sideways, like a predator studying prey it had grown bored of chasing. Oliver screamed suddenly, pointing to the far corner of the room. There, pressed against the black glass of the turned-off television, one of them was fully visible. Its fingers drummed lightly against the screen from the inside, tapping in rhythm with my racing heartbeat. Tap, tap, tap. Its mouth stretched unnaturally wide in a grin that didn't belong on any human face. I ripped the blanket off the couch and threw it over the TV, breaking the connection to the surface. The tapping stopped instantly, as if suffocated. "Upstairs," I ordered, grabbing Oliver's hand. "Now." We bolted up the staircase, the creaking wood groaning beneath each step. In my bedroom, I had already taped over the mirrors days ago, but now even that felt insufficient. The tape bulged outward unnaturally, small tears forming along the seams. I wedged a chair beneath the doorknob, barricading us inside. The whispers followed. "You belong here. You were promised. The child is not enough. Come home." I clutched Oliver against my chest, my back pressed to the wall, the storm outside raging like an exorcism tearing through the night. And then, the sound I feared most. The first mirror cracked. A high-pitched, glassy shriek filled the air as a spider-web fracture shot across the hallway mirror outside the bedroom. The vibrations shook the walls as though something was trying to crawl through. The voices grew louder, overlapping in a deafening crescendo. Oliver sobbed, covering his ears. I wrapped him tighter. Through the thin sliver between the door and floor, I saw it. Pale fingers curling against the hardwood outside. Long, jointless, sliding unnaturally across the floorboards like broken sticks, searching for flesh. Then came a second crack, this time from the bathroom mirror inside the bedroom. The glass trembled violently, and I saw it bulge forward, almost like fluid trapped behind thin ice. The barrier wouldn't hold much longer. I stared into the distortion forming inside the bulging mirror. Faces began to appear, melting into each other, fighting for dominance behind the membrane. One face stepped forward, mine. But wrong. Its head tilted, jaw unhinged slightly wider than human anatomy allowed, and it whispered directly into my mind. "Come back, Sarah. Finish what was started." I stumbled backward, pressing Oliver further into the corner as the mirror gave one final groan before settling, the glass pulsing like the beat of a heart. We were running out of time. My phone buzzed violently in my pocket. I fumbled for it with shaking fingers. A message, a number I didn't recognize. "They won't stop until it's sealed. The church kept the final ritual in the basement archive. Go now." I stared at the message in disbelief. It had to be Grayson. Or whatever was left of him. Oliver looked up at me, his face streaked with tears but filled with a strange, desperate clarity. "Mom, I'll be okay. You have to stop them." His voice was so small, but so certain. I kissed his forehead, fighting back the tears burning my eyes. "Stay hidden. Do not look in any mirrors, no matter what." I grabbed the old flashlight from my nightstand drawer, pushed the chair aside, and slowly cracked open the door. The hallway was quiet, but the walls pulsed like a living thing, and somewhere deeper inside this cursed house, I could feel them waiting for me. The house groaned under the weight of something unseen as I crept through the hallway, each step echoing unnaturally loud beneath my feet. The storm still raged outside, but now even the thunder seemed distant compared to the pulsing hum that filled the air inside. The mirrors, or what was left of them, shuddered as I passed. Each fractured surface trembled like the thin membrane of a living cell, struggling to contain what clawed behind them. Fingers pressed outward from the glass, sliding down the cracks with deliberate patience. I forced myself not to look too long. I couldn't give him that. The basement door loomed ahead. It had always been locked before. For days I'd avoided it like a coward, convincing myself there was nothing down there I wanted to see. But now the lock hung broken, not shattered, but undone, as though something inside had unlocked it from the other side. The air grew colder as I reached for the handle. My fingers hesitated for a moment, trembling not just from fear, but from the weight of what might wait below. I turned the knob. The door creaked open, exhaling a gust of stale metallic air that reeked of old stone and forgotten rituals. The wooden stairs groaned under my weight as I descended, each step creaking louder than the one before, like the house was warning me. The basement was larger than I'd imagined, stretching far deeper than the floor plan ever suggested. The narrow beam of my flashlight barely pierced the dense darkness ahead. And then I saw them. Symbols. The stone walls were covered in markings, crude, circular carvings etched directly into the concrete. Interwoven rings and mirrored triangles layered upon each other like countless failed attempts to perfect some ancient formula, the reflection doctrine. At the far end of the basement stood a heavy wooden altar, cracked and warped by age. Beside it, a tarnished brass stand held what looked like the remains of an old journal, bound in faded leather, the pages brittle and stained. The air was thick, almost gelatinous as I approached. Opening the journal sent a small cloud of dust swirling into the beam of my light. The writing was erratic, scratched in uneven lines by unsteady hands, but the words were unmistakable. The mirror is not a window. It is not a door. It is a mouth. A mouth that feeds on reflection. The anchor binds them. The anchor seals them. Without the anchor, the mouth opens. I flipped to the final pages where the ink grew darker, more frantic. The child was chosen. Blood of the blood. The anchor remains unfinished. The mouth grows hungry. Seal it with what was denied. My breath caught in my throat. Me. I was the unfinished anchor. The ritual had never been completed because my parents failed, because they refused to surrender me fully to the other side. My survival had left the wound open, festering all these years. The door behind me groaned. A soft scraping sound echoed across the stone floor, like nails dragging across concrete. I swung my flashlight around. They were here. Pale shapes slithered along the edges of the room, just beyond the beam of light. Their limbs bent unnaturally, joints reversing, heads cocked sideways as though curious, smooth, featureless faces watched me without eyes. The closest one pressed its elongated fingers into a shattered shard embedded in the wall, a broken piece of mirror still pulsing faintly. The creature's reflection inside the shard was clearer, sharper, as though the mirror showed its true form better than reality allowed. "You were promised." The words didn't come from its mouth. They drilled directly into my skull, vibrating through my bones. My knees buckled under the pressure of the voice. My flashlight slipped from my hand, clattering under the floor and spinning wildly, its beam slicing across dozens of pale figures, now fully surrounding me. They had crossed. I fumbled to my feet, eyes darting back toward the altar. The symbols etched into the journal burned into my mind. There had to be something I could do, some version of the ritual I could complete before they overwhelmed me. On the altar lay a small ceremonial knife, its blade blackened with age. My hand trembled as I lifted it. The creature stepped closer, closing the circle. Their voices overlapped inside my mind. Seal the mouth, seal it or be consumed. The markings on the floor beneath the altar now glowed faintly, responding to the presence of blood, of intent. I slashed the blade lightly across my palm, wincing as the sting blossomed through my hand. My blood dripped onto the altar, soaking into the old wood and filling the deep grooves carved into its surface. The glow brightened. The humming grew louder, turning into a deep, guttural vibration that shook the walls. The reflections inside the mirrors screamed, not in sound, but in a visceral psychic shriek that ripped through my mind like claws scraping against the inside of my skull. The creatures flinched. Some stumbled backward, their forms flickering. The cracks in the remaining mirrors widened. The mouth was destabilizing. I pressed my bleeding hand against the central symbol on the altar, the largest mirrored ring, and shouted the only words my instincts could find. "Seal me." The basement exploded in white light. The air sucked inward like a dying breath. The creatures shrieked as their forms disintegrated into flickering static, pulled back toward the mirrors like distorted shadows collapsing into themselves. The walls trembled. The symbols burned. The fragments of mirror exploded into fine dust, swirling into the vacuum created at the altar's center. And then, silence. The oppressive pressure vanished. I fell to my knees, gasping for air, my vision swimming in the dim glow of the dying sigils. They were gone. The mouth had closed, at least for now. But as the silence settled, a single thought crawled into my mind like an ember refusing to die. Oliver. I scrambled to my feet, stumbling up the basement stairs, the knife still clenched in my bloodied hand. Every instinct screamed to move faster, because I knew, even if the mouth was closed down here, it wasn't finished up there. The stairs seemed longer as I climbed back toward the first floor, my legs trembling beneath me. Each step groaned under my weight, not from age but from something deeper, like the house itself was shifting beneath my feet, recalibrating after what I had just done. The oppressive hum was gone, but the silence was worse. The house breathed differently now, as though I had damaged something beneath its skin but hadn't killed it entirely. "Oliver!" I shouted, my voice ragged, echoing into the emptiness. No answer. I stumbled into the hallway, scanning every corner, every door. The light fixtures flickered softly above me, casting thin, shaking beams across the warped walls. The mirrors, or what remained of them, had gone still, their cracked surfaces dark and empty, like blind eyes after the soul had left. I raced to the bedroom, throwing the door open. Empty. The blanket I had wrapped around Oliver was still bunched up where he had sat, but he was gone. My stomach flipped. The panic clawed up my throat like bile, and then I heard it, faint, distant, a small voice calling from below, from inside the house, from inside the walls. "Mommy." I froze, my breath caught painfully in my chest. The voice repeated, but it wasn't quite right. The tone was off, like an echo recorded and played back imperfectly. Close, but not him. I stumbled toward the sound, following it down the hallway past the living room until I stood before the large mirror in the front hall, the last fully intact surface in the house. Its surface rippled faintly. Behind the glass, the faint silhouette of Oliver stood, staring at me. He was inside. No, something wearing him was inside, his head tilted slightly, mimicking the unnatural movements of the creatures I'd seen before. His mouth smiled too wide. "Mommy, it's okay now. You sealed them. You can come inside now too." The voice was layered, just slightly distorted. I took a step backward. "No," I whispered, my voice cracking. "No, that's not my son. The thing behind the glass smiled wider, as though amused by my resistance. "He's here, Mommy. He's safe in here." Another form appeared behind the false Oliver, taller, thinner, its pale fingers resting gently on his shoulder, like a puppeteer standing behind its puppet. It was one of them, and it had him. The glass began to pulse again. I felt it in my head this time, the way it burrowed into my mind, weaving whispers into my thoughts. "Come home, complete what your parents failed to finish. Bring the child fully across. Anchor complete." Tears burned my eyes as I shook my head violently. "You can't have him," I said, my voice rising despite the quiver, but the whispers only grew more insistent. "He was always promised. You were always meant to deliver him." The surface of the mirror stretched like thin plastic as the form of Oliver's doppelganger pressed closer. His small palm pressed against the inside of the glass, fingers splaying wide as though reaching for me. I stumbled backward, colliding into the console table, sending a lamp crashing to the floor. The flashlight I had carried before rolled toward my feet. And then it hit me, the journal from the basement, the final note Grayson had written. "The mirror feeds on reflection. Starve it." I stared into the glass, heart pounding. The thing inside needed my fear, needed my acknowledgement to hold the tether. I dropped to my knees, closing my eyes tightly, forcing my mind to go still. I wouldn't look. I wouldn't answer. The whispers howled angrily in my head as though sensing my rebellion. "Look at him. Look at your son. He needs you." My fingers dug into my palms as I kept my eyes sealed shut. "No," I whispered. "You're not him." The house trembled, the walls vibrating as the mirror's surface slapped and stretched with increasing fury. But I kept my head down. The voice shifted, growing more desperate. "You will lose him forever. You will lose everything." Tears streamed down my face, but I held fast. "I'd rather lose him than feed you." A high-pitched shriek ripped through the house, not through my ears but through my mind, splitting my thoughts like shattered glass. I heard the mirror crack, not just once but over and over, fractures spidering across its surface. The pressure built until, with one final, deafening snap, the entire mirror imploded inward. The force of the collapse sent me sprawling backward as shards of glass exploded around me, raining down like razor-edged snow. And then, silence. True silence. The kind of silence where even the house no longer breathed. The air was still, empty. When I dared to open my eyes, all that remained of the mirror was a jagged black hole in the wall. And then I heard it. A soft sob. From behind me, I turned. Oliver. The real Oliver, crouched under the staircase, his face streaked with tears, but his eyes were clear, human. I crawled toward him on shaking hands and knees, wrapping him in my arms as tightly as I could, sobbing into his hair. "I've got you," I whispered over and over. "I've got you." "They tried, Mommy," he choked out. "They tried to pull me in." "I know, baby. I know." The house no longer pulsed. The reflections were empty. The mouth, for now, was closed, but somewhere in the deepest part of me I could feel it. It wasn't destroyed. It was simply waiting. The storm finally broke sometime before dawn. For the first time in what felt like days, the rain stopped hammering the roof. The wind no longer howled through the trees. The air in the house was unnervingly still, the kind of stillness that settles only after something immense has ended, or retreated. Oliver lay asleep on the couch, wrapped tightly in blankets, his chest rising and falling in slow, steady rhythm. I sat beside him, eyes wide open, afraid to close them. I knew better. The house was quiet, but not healed. It would never be healed. The mirrors had shattered, the reflections were gone, and yet, some part of me knew. What we had faced was not entirely defeated, only locked away again, waiting for another crack, The sun finally rose, casting pale orange light through the slats of the boarded-up windows. In that fragile light, for a brief moment, everything almost felt normal again. But normal was a lie. Later that morning, Sheriff Harlan arrived, having received one of my frantic calls from the night before. The dispatcher had heard my terrified voice, the broken screams, the begging. She'd sent help, though I doubted they truly knew what kind of help was needed. The sheriff stood in the entryway, surveying the broken glass and splintered frames with narrowed eyes. "You said there was an intruder," he began cautiously, not quite meeting my gaze. "There was," I said softly, "but not anymore." He shifted awkwardly, glancing once toward the shattered remains of the large mirror. "You mind telling me what really happened here, Sarah?" I met his eyes. "You wouldn't believe me." "Try me." I almost laughed. The absurdity of trying to explain the truth to someone who had never seen them, never heard their voices inside the walls, felt like its own kind of horror. Instead, I shook my head. "We're safe now. That's all that matters." Sheriff Harlan exhaled heavily, clearly frustrated but unsure how to press further. "We'll file a report for the insurance folks, but I suggest you take some time away from this house." I nodded. "We will." After he left, I packed whatever I could fit into the car: clothes, documents, some of Oliver's drawings, though many of them I left behind, unable to bear looking at those monstrous shapes anymore. By the afternoon, we were on the road, leaving Maple Crescent behind us. But even as the house shrank in the rearview mirror, I felt no relief, only distance. We drove for hours, deeper into the countryside, until eventually we arrived at a small roadside motel. Old, quiet, forgettable, exactly what I needed. Oliver curled into the bed almost immediately, his exhaustion finally overtaking his fear. I sat near the window, staring at the reflection of myself in the darkened TV screen across the room. For several minutes, it was just me, and then a flicker, almost imperceptible. The reflection blinked a half-second too late. I froze, my breath catching sharply in my chest. The air in the motel room thickened slightly, as if something had pressed itself against the walls from the inside. And in my head, a voice I recognized whispered again, "You sealed the mouth, but cracks remain. We are patient." A cold shiver danced down my spine. My throat tightened. I stood slowly, grabbing the motel towel and throwing it over the television screen. The reflection vanished beneath the fabric. I turned to Oliver, still sleeping peacefully, his tiny hand clutching his stuffed rabbit. I whispered softly into the dark, as much for myself as for him, "You won't have him." The room remained quiet after that, but the weight never left. Days passed, weeks. We kept moving. New towns, new hotels, never staying long, never anywhere with too many mirrors. And yet, every reflection felt like a door I couldn't fully close. Even now, when I glance at the bathroom mirror in yet another anonymous motel, sometimes I swear I see it. A shadow just beyond the glass, fingers tracing the edge, a grin forming slowly, patiently. Waiting. Because I know now what they are. They aren't gone. They never leave. They follow bloodlines. They follow memory. They follow me. I was never just a survivor. I was the anchor. And anchors, by nature, always stay connected. The mouth is closed for now. But one day, when the crack is wide enough again, they will come back. And this time, I don't know if I'll be strong enough to stop them. Thank you for joining us on this chilling journey into the shadows of the reflection doctrine. Sometimes, the scariest monsters aren't the ones hiding under your bed, but the ones waiting quietly behind every reflection, patiently watching from just beyond the glass. If this story sent a shiver down your spine, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with others who dared to explore the dark. Your support helps us bring more haunting tales to light. And remember, not every mirror shows the truth, and some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and stay out of the mirrors.